we've covered many different prayers and actually several different unique services. So anybody remember back to the very beginning? What's the very first let's say section of the service that we have? If anybody remember what it's called?
Psuke de Zimra.
Not Psuke de Zimra. Yes. What was that, Romeo?
Birkot HaShachar.
All right. Oh, sorry.
Birkot HaShachar.
That's better. Okay. Birkot HaShachar, right? Our morning blessings. And if you recall, that was what began as individual blessings that a person recites as they're waking up, and then eventually got transferred into the synagogue. So that's the very beginning. And then, Miriam, as you said, we've got Psuke de Zimra.
Okay.
All right. And what's next?
Shacharit.
Shacharit is too general.
The
Shema,
Amidah.
the blessings.
All right. Kriyat Shema uvirchotecha, right? The Shema with its blessings, and then the Amidah. All right. So on any morning service, any Shacharit service, these are the four major elements of that service. So I figured that for the next section we had some options, and instead of dealing with Tachanun, I wanted to deal with something that may be a little bit more familiar. And so we're going to now shift into talking about the Torah service. All right. So the Torah service. So to begin with, when in your experience of attending Torah services, whether on Shabbat or on festivals or on a weekday service that has a Torah reading, what seem to be the overall themes? Thinking about it, taking a step back, what are the overall themes that seem to be emphasized in a Torah service?
Reverence for God's word.
Okay, so the reverence for God, right? So we're reading the Torah, God's word, and we're doing it in a very reverential way. Yeah, what else? Well, one aspect is community. There's a very strong focus on community, and we're going to see this manifested in detail. But speaking generally, we only take the Torah out of the ark, and we only have this public Torah reading when we have a minyan, right? So we don't do it as individuals. We've got to have a minyan in order to do it. Think about taking the Torah out of the ark. It's paraded around the congregation, right? It has to be brought out through the community. There are all sorts of extra blessings that get incorporated into the Torah service, right? Think of all the Mishaberachs that are recited. For every person who goes up to receive an honor, we give prayers for the country, prayers for the community, prayers for the people who support the community. So the Torah service seems to be the place that really focuses on that. We don't throw in those blessings in other parts of the service. It's specifically in the Torah service that those take place. Pageant, right? So the Torah service is a pageant, right? So what is a pageant? Pageant is ritualized, and so in this case, it's a ritualized learning that's taking place. So initially, the primary purpose of the Torah service is educational. We're supposed to listen to words God, but it's not just listen to God's word. It's not just educational, though. There's this aspect of revelation that we stand at Sinai when we read from the Torah. So it's a highly ritualized learning. And the word pageant is a word that one of my teachers in rabbinical school suggested, which is it's like we go through almost a script. And the Passover Seder is similar to this also, right? We have a script that we go through, and we, for the Seder, there's a meal and prayers and telling a story. And it's a script that everybody that we know, because we do the exact same thing every year. We have a set book that we do it in, and it's highly ritualized. It's filled with customs and traditions. And the Torah service is like that also, right? We know what the Torah service is going to look like from week to week, and yet we kind of go through this script as a community every single week. And all right, so if we wanted to know where the Torah service comes from, right, as a service, where would we go to look?
Ezra and Nehemiah.
So the first place we could look is in the Bible. You're jumping the gun a little bit, Max. We're going to look at Nehemiah shortly, but we would look at the Bible, and we would see, are there Torah services that we can find in the Bible? And once we've done that, we can now look at the Mishnah, right? That's our earliest layer of rabbinic writing. And then, of course, we look at the Talmud. And what we find by the time we get to the end of the Talmud is that we don't have a tremendous amount of detail about what actually takes place during the Torah service. Either that, or there isn't a whole lot that's taking place during the Torah service. And so really the first complete service, something that we would recognize as a service in some fashion similar to ours, doesn't appear in writing until the 8th century. So this is after the Talmud is done in what's called Masechet Sofrim, tractate Sofrim. Sofrim is like scribes. And it's kind of thrown in at the kind of after the Talmud in some publications of the Talmud. And it's considered to be one of the minor tractates, but it's really not part of the Talmud. It's written later, and it includes all sorts of rules, certainly about how to write a Torah scroll, but it also has a lot of liturgy in it. And so it's a very helpful resource in terms of seeing how liturgy developed. All right, and then finally, when we get to prayer books, the first prayer books in medieval times, then we also start to see prayers that are included to surround the reading of the Torah. I mean, think about what makes up our Torah service. At the middle of it, we take the Torah to the Ark and we read from it, but we begin and we end that with kind of these grand pageants and parades accompanied by biblical verses, and then we throw in the extra Mishaberachs in there. So you can imagine how what initially began maybe as just a public reading from the scroll grew and developed. And so in our medieval prayer books, that will be an important source for us. So let's start with the Torah. All right, there is one description in the Torah of reading from the Torah in some fashion. And it's known by the rabbis as mitzvat hakhel. Hakhel means to gather, right? To assemble. Kehillah is a congregation or an assembly. So the hakhel is a verb saying, make an assembly, bring everybody together. And so this appears in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17. And it comes in the context of, well, it seems to be connected to laws for kings. So let's see what it says here. And as we read it, try and forget anything that we might know about the Torah service. What is this text saying to do, and what seems to be its purpose in doing so? So, and Moses instructed them as follows. Every 7th year, the year set for remission, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place that he will choose, you shall read this teaching aloud in the presence of all Israel. Gather the people, right? That's our word. Hakhel et ha'am. Gather the people, men, women, children, and the strangers in your communities, that they may hear and so learn to revere the Lord your God and to observe faithfully every word of this teaching. Their children too, who have not had the experience, shall hear and learn to revere the Lord your God as long as they live in the land that you are about to cross the Jordan to possess. All right, so setting is they're on the eastern banks of the Jordan River, or they're getting ready to cross over. Moses is giving this instruction to the Israelites. So what did we see here? What's the commandment?
Everybody is to gather, and that's everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Torah, or the instruction, whatever that is going to be read in every 7th year.
Yeah,
So
so
tell the
it says,
story over and over again.
yeah, go ahead, Joan. Joan, you were saying something?
Oh, we tell the story over and over again. And I also, it's a little offbeat, but I was wondering whether this Hakil is the same root as Kahila.
Yes, it is. Yeah. So it's to gather, to make a community. Cindy, as you point out, it's everyone, men, women, children, and strangers.
Meaning non-Jews, right?
Well, what the Deuteronomy means by that is a little unclear. Probably means non-Israelites.
What, meaning what? How does that differentiate from non-Jews? Obviously, because Judah didn't exist yet.
Yeah, in the days of Deuteronomy, the idea of Judaism as a religion didn't really exist. It was more of an ethnic identity that carried a belief system and a worship system along with it. And so you can imagine there are people living in that territory that do not identify, well, that are not part of the kind of ethnic national group called Israel.
Yeah, I erroneously meant that when I said non-Jews.
The term in Hebrew is gercha asher b'sharet, the ger that is in your gates, stranger in your gates, which is a non-Israelite, right?
There's also emphasis on to hear and learn and to revere the Lord.
Okay, so there's an
Mentioned
aspect of
twice.
hearing, learning, and then the hearing and the learning developing into a sense of fear of God.
What I find interesting is there's no distinction here of Noahide laws versus Torah for Israelites.
Oh no, definitely not.
They're all supposed to be learning, even the strangers.
Yeah. Now, what it is that they're reading is a little unclear. The term is HaTorah Hazot, this Torah, this instruction. So does it mean the entire 5 books of Moses? Probably not, because that concept didn't exist until later. It might mean the book of Deuteronomy, or at least portions from the book of Deuteronomy. We can kind of hang on to that question, and we may be able to get an answer a little bit later.
Is this even logistically possible to bring millions of people to the same place? It doesn't say if they're going to only read it once and you have to be within hearing distance without any kind of digital amplification.
Yeah, they're saying
who's going to tend to the flocks, and you're going to leave things undefended.
Yeah, everybody. And how often is it?
Once
Every 7 years, which
every
is
7 years on the Shemitah year during Sukkot. So Sukkot already is a big pilgrimage festival. In fact, it's the biggest of the pilgrimage festivals. It was a big party in Jerusalem. Everybody who could, went there for the festival. So this is a good time to do a public Torah reading, because a large chunk of the nation has already descended upon the capital. I think about Hajj, right? Where, millions and millions and millions of people go to Mecca. That's a lot of people, right? And so they have an entire country that is at least tried to build the infrastructure to accommodate all of these tourists. So I would imagine something similar may take place during Sukkot once a year, and maybe especially every 7th year during the Hakhel year. Right? If it actually took place, right? So we have this being described in Deuteronomy. Did this happen or not? Well, I'm not sure that we've got much evidence. Certainly the Bible doesn't describe this taking place, at least in the way that it's being described here. So that's kind of interesting. Later on in Deuteronomy, in the rules for kings, the king is instructed to have a copy of this Torah, same expression, made for him and he has to keep it with him at all times, and he's got to read from it every day. So there seems to be, Deuteronomy seems to have this vision of the scholar king, the king who is studying Torah every day, and then to make sure that words get out to the people, once every 7 years, there's this big assembly, and then it's read publicly to everyone.
Now, what's interesting is the people who go to Jerusalem for Sukkot technically only has to be the men, correct, for bringing sacrifices? But this is now bringing everybody.
No, I think Sukkot is everyone.
Is that everyone? I mean, in terms of minimum requirement, I mean.
Yeah, Sukkot in Deuteronomy, you shall rejoice in your festival with your son and daughter, your male and female slave, the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow in your community.
Okay, so they're already there.
Festival for the Lord your God 7 days in the place that the Lord your God will choose, right? So that's in Deuteronomy. So
much for a positive time-bound mitzvah.
yeah, I mean, well, the positive time-bound mitzvah, that's rabbinic, it's later. You know, what does the book of Deuteronomy say? Well, we've got this holiday at Sukkot, which is this big festival. And once every 7 years, this is done as a part of it. All right, that's our first piece of evidence, right? Because this is describing a ritual of some sort, a ritualized public reading of the Torah.
Rabbi,
right. Yes.
so is this instruction coming from God or from Moses?
Well, Vayitzav Moshe otam lemor. Moses commanded them, saying. So this language seems to be coming from Moses, right? But Moses is the lawgiver. Moses is kind of empowered to do stuff like this by God. So, all right, let's look at now the first actual description of a Torah service. This is a text I like to teach. You may have looked at this text with me in the past. It's from Nehemiah, chapter 8. And Nehemiah and Ezra are these two important figures in the rebuilding and rededication of the Second Temple. So Nehemiah is a governor that is sent from Persia to go to the land of Israel. And he's given the commission of rebuilding the temple, right? So the project had already begun, but it kind of stalled. There didn't seem to be a lot of enthusiasm among the locals, or maybe, they just were poorly organized. And it turns out that Nehemiah was a very good leader. He was a very good administrator. And so he got things, they bring in him and he gets things up and running again. Ezra is the scribe. He's kind of a religious leader. He's a priest and a scribe. And so between the two of them, Ezra and Nehemiah are able to really build up a revived kind of Israelite community in the land of Israel with the blessings of the Persian Empire. So this chapter occurs right after the temple has been finished, right? They've finished it, and now they're going to dedicate it and put it into practice. So they gather everyone together. So I'll go ahead and read this. The entire people assembled as one man in the square before the water gate, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the scroll of the teaching of Moses with which the Lord had charged Israel. On the first day of the 7th month, in fact, what is the first day of the 7th month?
Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah, right? Very good. Ezra the priest brought the teaching before the congregation, men and women, and all who could listen with understanding. He read from it, facing the square before the water gate, from the first light until midday, to the men and the women and those who could understand. The ears of all the people were given to the scroll of the teaching. Ezra the scribe stood upon a wooden tower made for the purpose. And beside him stood Matitya, Shema, Anaya, Uriah, Hilkiah, and Maasela at his right, and at his left, Pedala, Mishael, Malchiah, Hashum, Hashbadana, Zechariah, Meshulam. All right, so what do we have here? What have we just read?
It sounds like what we just read, but it actually happened, whereas the other one was a command to do it.
Yeah, there does seem to be a connection between this and the text from Deuteronomy, right? The focus on, men and women and everyone who could understand, which, maybe that means any child old enough to have understanding, perhaps. We have people assembled. We're reading from the Torah and it's also connected, it's the Torah of Moses. And before it was Moses who was giving the instructions to read from the Torah. What else do we see?
Sorry, does the teaching of Moses or the scroll of the teaching of Moses limit it to Deuteronomy, or that could be all of the 5 books?
Who knows? What did that term mean in the days of Ezra? Well, Deuteronomy actually is the scroll of Moses, because Moses is the speaker throughout Deuteronomy, right? Moses is the one who is recounting to the Israelites everything that has happened. He's recounting all of the instructions from God, and it's put in Moses's mouth. So if you wanted to refer to something as the Torah of Moses, the book of Deuteronomy would be a good bet for that attribution.
Who are all these people standing beside Ezra?
All right, who are all these people? They seem to be some dignitaries, right? These are the people that got the good seats, right? And where are they standing?
On the tower.
On a wooden tower. What do we call that?
Raised
The Bema.
The bema, right? All right, so we're describing the bema, right? So the setting is you've got Ezra, the Torah reader, up in front. What's his position? He's standing, and he's surrounded by dignitaries, and they're standing up, and they're facing the people, and they read from first light until midday. That's 6 hours of Torah reading. That's a lot. All right, so now we get some more description. Ezra opened the scroll in the sight of all the people, for he was above all the people. All right, so now we know this is a raised platform. As he opened it, all the people stood up. Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and all the people answered, Amen, Amen, with hands upraised. Then they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves before the Lord with their faces to the ground. Yeshua, Bani, Shrevia, Yamin, Akub, Shabtai, Hodaya, Maaseiah, Kalita, Azariah, Ozabad, Hanan, Playa, and the Levites explained the teaching to the people while the people stood in their places. They read from the scroll of the teaching of God, translating it and giving the sense so they understood the reading. Okay, so what have we learned now?
Agba.
So we get Hagba, right? He opens the scroll so that they can see it, right? Probably, actually, the original name was Galila, which is to roll or to unroll. Hagba means to lift, but and originally they were the same. They were really the same action. All right, what other details do we have?
The people are standing during this, and I'm trying to imagine, did they put out seats for the people? Because if they stood when the scroll was open, presumably they were standing before, but then it says that they also stood in their places for the entire drash that we're going to get to.
6 hours of standing might be a long time. Right?
That's a long time.
Well, my feeling is, I love the way you're doing this, because it's giving something magical to the Torah to me. There's magic.
Yeah,
All these
I mean, people have
gather
this tremendous awe. It almost feels spontaneous, right? He holds it up, they all stand up, and then they bow down to the ground, prostrate to the ground.
It's like
What else? What else can we gather from this reading, from this passage?
So if this was on Rosh Hashanah, there's presumably not other prayers that they need to be saying at this time.
Not apparently, not from this description. What about this business about these, now we have a second set of dignitaries and the Levites, and they're explaining the teaching to the people. Right? Translating it, again, giving the sense. Right? Why do they need to do that?
Because the people are not literate.
Because the people, not only they're not literate, they don't understand the language that the Torah is written.
Oh,
They don't understand the Hebrew. Hebrew is not their language. They speak Aramaic. And so they need people who are educated to make it understood. So Max, you were talking about the logistical issues earlier. So, maybe we have a series of callers who are spaced out among the people to kind of push the message forward. Maybe they're just shouting it out and taking turns giving the translation. And it seems that they're giving more than just the translation because they're translating it and they're giving the sense of it. Because ultimately the purpose is for the people to understand, and a translation by itself may not be sufficient for the people to understand.
is this like doing the Vulgate?
Sorry, say that again, Jim?
Is it like doing the Vulgate?
Yeah, so they're translating it into Aramaic, and what's described here eventually became instituted as the Targum. Targum means translation, but it refers specifically to the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible. And the person who does the translating is called the Meturgaman, the translator. And so eventually there developed a tradition during Torah readings where you'd have one person reading out of the scroll, and standing next to that person would be a translator. And after every verse or two, the reader would stop, and the translator would do exactly what is described here, translate it into Aramaic, which the people understood, and expand a little bit. Make sure that if they needed to fill any gaps in, they would do so to make sure that people could understand. And often there'd be elaboration. You can imagine that a lot of the early midrashim may have been expressed in the context of the Targum, of the public Torah reading that was taking place. This is kind of like the precursor to the Devar Torah, to the Drash sermon.
It's interesting that they're interspersed, even verse by verse, where today we have a Torah reading that is sacrosanct, you do not interrupt,
Right.
and then we do a Peshat, and then we do a Drash.
Right.
But we all
that's a little bit of a unique setup that we're doing for.
Well, yeah, but even before COVID, we'd have you or the bar bat mitzvah kid would do a
Right.
presentation, and then there'd be a Devar Torah at the end.
Yeah.
So there was still kind of today we have these layers and strata, and it sounds like originally they're much more interspersed.
Well, so I think one question that we have is what's being described in Nehemiah, is this a one-off event, or are they establishing something that's regular?
Well, even independent of whether that's whichever way the answer is for that, we have a printed text that gives us a translation. So if we need a translation or want our translation, we have it with us, but they didn't. So they had to, that's why they might have to do it, every couple of verses or so. Whereas we have translation while we're sitting there.
Yeah, the Meturgaman was doing it on the fly. Yeah. Okay, let's continue in Nehemiah. Nehemiah the Tirshata, Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who were explaining to the people, said to all the people, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. You must not mourn or weep." For all the people were weeping as they listened to the words of the teaching. He further said to them, "Go, eat choice foods and drink sweet drinks, and send portions to whoever has." The Levites were quieting the people, saying, "Hush, for the day is holy, do not be sad." Then all the people went to eat and drink and send portions and make great merriment, for they understood the things they were told. All right, so what details do we have now?
They have Kiddush lunch or Kiddush
All right,
dinner.
so they have Kiddush. First recorded Kiddush. Actually, the second recorded Kiddush, but this is What else? What else do we know? How do the people, what's their emotional response to hearing the Torah?
They were weeping.
They're weeping, and weeping out of mourning, sadness. So why would they be sad?
Why are they so sad and listening to this?
That's the question. Why are they so sad?
I thought I remember hearing that Nehemiah wept because he realized they hadn't been doing this.
Well, it doesn't seem to be Nehemiah the one weeping.
Yeah.
It seems to be the one reassuring. But the people, I think you're right, Cindy, is that maybe they're embarrassed or they feel guilty that the things that they're hearing Ezra reading about, they've not been following. And they feel terrible about that. They're not, and this kind of keeps in with the big religious and political revival that Nehemiah and Ezra are leading. So the people are sad, they're beating themselves up, but the leaders, the translators, they're reassuring them, don't worry, this is a day for joy. We're going to celebrate, right? And how do they celebrate? Not just eating and drinking.
But what else?
Send portions. Where
They
they're
gotta
sending
send
the
portions.
portions.
That sound familiar?
Yeah, but where are they sending the portions?
Yeah, well, what does that sound familiar? Does that sound like anything?
Purim?
Does sound like Purim, doesn't it?
Remember, they returned from Persia.
Yeah, it's I'm going to read that verse in Hebrew. Ve'elchu kol ha'am le'echov l'shtot, right? Then all the people went to eat and to drink. Uli shaleach manot, shloach manot,
Manot. That's good.
v'lasot simcha gedolah, and to make a great celebration. Ki evinu b'divrim asher hodayu lehem, because they understood the words that had been spoken to them. So so we seem to see that, how do you celebrate? How do you have a big public celebration? By eating and drinking and sending portions to other people, right?
And why
And we
they
see that at Purim
celebrate?
also, right? It's the exact same language that we see in chapter 9 of Megillat Esther.
First time they heard the Torah.
Why are they celebrating?
They've just rebuilt the temple.
Okay.
It's a big religious revival. And Nehemiah and Ezra, they want this to be a day of celebration. They don't want the people to feel guilty. They want to empower them.
So this is the first time they met in the new rebuilt synagogue?
Well, this is the temple, right? So this is like where the
temple.
sacrifices are going to take place,
Yeah.
right? So in the year 586 BCE, the temple had been destroyed. The people sent into exile. And then 70 years later, the Persians kind of are in charge. They send them back and say, rebuild the temple. And they started to, but they didn't really get very far. And then sometime in the 5th century, it's renewed with under the leadership of Nehemiah and Ezra.
I thought Solomon was responsible for rebuilding the temple.
Solomon, that was first temple.
What?
That was first temple.
Oh, the first temple. Oh, okay.
So we're talking second temple.
This is the second one. Okay.
5th century BCE. All right, so let's see what happens next. On the second day, the heads of the clans of all the peoples and the priests and Levites gathered to Ezra the scribe to study the words of the teaching, right? They haven't had enough of it yet. They found written in the teaching that the Lord had commanded Moses that the Israelites must dwell in booths during the festival of the 7th month, and that they must announce and proclaim throughout all their towns and Jerusalem as follows. Go out to the mountains and bring leafy branches of olive trees, pine trees, myrtles, palms, and other leafy trees to make booths as it is written. All right, so what happens?
That's Sukkot.
Well, they read about Sukkot.
Yeah, but they're supposed to bring all these leafy leaves from trees and stuff. So that means that they have to cover a booth with it.
Right. So, but remember, they stayed over the second day, and while they were studying with Ezra and all the other teachers, they came across this description of Sukkot. And they said, "Oh, we better observe Sukkot." And by the way, it's coming up, the 14th day of the month. We don't have a lot of time, right? Now, interesting, the details for Sukkot is kind of combines what we know as the 4 species and the building of the huts. And now this is having them build the huts out of these different kinds of plants. Kind of interesting. This description here does not appear in the Torah, so this seems to be something a little bit different. And now finally, this is the end of the chapter. So the people went out and brought them and made themselves booths on their roofs, in their courtyards, in the courtyards of the house of God, in the square of the water gate, and in the square of the Ephraim gate. In other words, wherever they could find a scrap of land, they built their booths. The whole community that returned from the captivity made booths and dwelt in the booths. The Israelites had not done so from the days of Joshua, son of Nun, to that day. And there was very great rejoicing. He read from the scroll of the teaching of God each day, from the first to the last day. They celebrated the festival 7 days, and there was a solemn gathering on the 8th, as prescribed. Okay, so order of events. They assemble everybody on Rosh Hashanah, well, what we call Rosh Hashanah. And here it's just the holiday, or the holiday, the sacred occasion on the first day of the 7th month. The second day they keep studying. They learn about Sukkot. They come back 2 weeks later. They've built Sukkot. Now they spend each of those 7 days not only celebrating, but also reading from the Torah every single day of the festival. And then they get to the 8th day of solemn assembly. That's Shmini Atzeret. That's also in the Torah. And they celebrate that as well, exactly as written. Kakatu, as it is written. All right, what is missing from this story? Well, yeah, there's no Simchat Torah. That's true. What else is missing?
Sacrifices.
No description of sacrifices.
They've skipped over Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
Well, we had Rosh Hashanah. Like we had a celebration on the first day of the month.
Okay.
Right. The name Rosh Hashanah doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible. That's the rabbis' term.
But where's Yom Kippur?
Where is Yom Kippur? That is an excellent question. And I don't have an answer for that. It's not here. All right. Now, what else is interesting is the description here that nobody had celebrated Sukkot like this since the days of Joshua. In other words, since ancient history, since the Israelites were in the wilderness. Or since they, entered into the land. Before there was a temple, never throughout the days of the first temple was there ever a celebration of Sukkot the way that Nehemiah describes it here. So that's really fascinating. And all of this.
How do they know that?
Sorry, how does it know that? Well, that's an interesting question also. Nehemiah is written at a particular time and place. So how do they know that?
There was a record of it.
Right. So, part of this may be an attempt to try and build up the accomplishments of Ezra and Nehemiah. But this is a fascinating text. There's such a strong emphasis on reading and learning, right? So that we're going to have this public reading, and it's not enough to just read it as kind of pro forma. It has to be understood by the people who are reading and who are hearing it. And if we need to bring in experts to make that happen, that's what's taking place. And it is leading to them taking action. And if you think back to what it had said in the Deuteronomy text, what's the purpose of it? It's to read it so that people learn it and then experience, develop awe of God. So this text from Nehemiah seems to be inspired pretty directly by the Hakhel text that we saw in Deuteronomy. All right, now, we do not know whether this was a one-time event or whether this inspired a new tradition of public Torah readings. The Nehemiah doesn't say, right? So we certainly know that there eventually were public readings of the Torah taking place on a regular basis. And as one can imagine, the rabbis, when they're trying to construct this history and establish the authenticity of public reading of Torah, they point back to Ezra and the Great Sanhedrin that established this system. It's this passage from Nehemiah would seem to support, that, story that the rabbis tell. All right, so now let's fast forward to Second Temple times, late Second Temple times. And as we've seen before, the Mishnah is a really good text for that, because in addition to providing the rules as the rabbis imagine for a new kind of templeless Judaism, it also preserves memories and memories of things that took place during the temple. And so we're gonna see that here. So this is from Tractate Sota in the Mishnah. And this passage begins asking, how are the blessings of the high priest recited on Yom Kippur, right? So during Second Temple times, the high priest has a big job. He has to perform all of these atonement rituals on behalf of the people. And there's a lot of steps involved in that. The Torah describes actually in quite a bit of detail all of the sacrifices that are performed. So this is a really big deal. Now, here we have the Mishnah describing one element of what the high priest had to do. So here's what we do. The synagogue attendant, right? Chazan HaKnesset. So there was something called a synagogue, takes a Torah scroll and gives it to the head of the synagogue. And the head of the synagogue gives it to the deputy high priest, right? We run into that deputy high priest before. And the deputy high priest gives it to the high priest. All right. So we seem to have a ritual passing of the Torah from one dignitary to the next dignitary. And the high priest stands and receives it and reads after the death. So this is Acharei Mot. This is Leviticus chapter 16. This is what we read as the Torah reading on Yom Kippur today. So here it's describing this was taking place in the temple. But on the 10th, so this is a passage from Leviticus 23, Parshat Emor. We do not read this on Yom Kippur. And rolls the Torah and places it on his bosom and says, more than what I have read before you is written here. He reads by heart and on the 10th from the book of Numbers, right? So he's memorized this additional passage from the book of Numbers. This is what we read as the maftir reading on Yom Kippur. So on Yom Kippur, we take out two Torahs. In the first one, we read Leviticus 16, and from the second one, we read Leviticus 29. So what's being described here is seemingly a somewhat similar practice that took place in the temple by the high priest. All right, so then what happens? And he recites 8 blessings concerning the Torah and concerning the service, the avodah, we talked about that before, and concerning thanksgiving, and concerning forgiveness for iniquity, and concerning the temple, and concerning the Jewish people, and concerning the priests, and concerning Jerusalem, and the rest of the prayer. All right, so what can we remember? Unlearn, forget everything we think we know about what takes place during a Torah service and on Yom Kippur. What does this Mishnah actually describe?
There's the first paragraph is pageantry, the second paragraph is a reading, and the third paragraph is blessings. And the Mishnah opens with, how are the blessings of the high priest recited? So it sounds like it really wants to get to the blessings, and everything else is just leading up to that.
Yeah. Exactly. I'm intrigued by this expression in the second paragraph. More than what I read before you is written here, right? We don't have time to read the entire book. So I've just read some of it, and there's a lot more, along these lines. All right, so that's the high priest every Yom Kippur reading this passage. Let's look at the next Mishnah, right? So this is same chapter, immediately after this. And it begins exactly the same way. How is the portion of the king recited? All right, so first high priest, now we're talking about the king. At the conclusion of the first day of the festival. So the festival, Hechag, that's Sukkot. That's what the rabbis call Sukkot. That's what the Torah calls Sukkot, right? So at the conclusion of the first day of the festival, on the 8th, after the conclusion of the sabbatical year, they make a wooden platform for him in the courtyard, him being the king, and he sits on it. As it is stated, at the end of every 7 years in the festival of the sabbatical year, right? So this is the Hakhel that actually, no, this is not the this is chapter 31. So this is a little different. The synagogue attendant takes a Torah scroll and gives it to the head of the synagogue. And the head of the synagogue gives it to the deputy high priest. And the deputy high priest gives it to the high priest. And the high priest gives it to the king. And the king stands and receives it and reads while sitting. All right. So we can see this is constructed very similarly to what we read about the high priest. What elements are different so far?
Or the king.
All right, so it's the king, yeah. So what about the king's reading is different than the high priest's reading?
He's sitting.
Well, they actually tell you the choreography of who's standing and who's sitting, which is nice.
Okay. Well, earlier we saw the high priest was standing, right? Does it say that?
Yeah.
Wasn't everybody standing?
No, he just receives it and reads. Yeah.
It doesn't say if he sits down to read it or not.
Yeah. Here we're in the courtyard. And so this probably refers to what was known as Ezrat Nashim, the women's section. And it's not the women's section because only women were there. It's the women's section because that was the farthest into the temple areas that women could go. So it was a co-ed environment. So that's probably where the king is. They make a bima for him. That sound familiar? Oh yeah, that's what Ezra was reading from. He receives it while standing, but then he sits down to read. All right, and now we have a little interlude in the Mishnah. King Agrippa arose and received it and read standing, and the sages praised him. So who is this King Agrippa? He is a king, an Israelite king, during the very end of the Second Temple, so 1st century CE, after Herod, right? Maybe like the 30s or 40s of the Common Era. There's a lot of stories about King Agrippa, things that King Agrippa did. The rabbis seem to like him, and here this is a good example of it. So we're describing something that sounds like it was a historical event. That somebody's remembering this. So what did he do? Instead of sitting down to read it, he stands to read it. And the sages of the day, they were there, they liked what he was doing. And when he arrived at, you may not appoint a foreigner over you, in Deuteronomy 17, tears flowed from his eyes. Why is he crying?
Out of fear?
Why would he be so sad that when he gets to this verse?
Because of the Romans ruling.
Yeah, he sees it's talking about him. He's the descendant of Herod, right? And Herod came from the Idumeans, who were kind of brought into the people, and then he had some half Hasmonean, half Idumean background, and so he reads this passage and he says, who am I? I'm a foreigner. He sees himself as a foreigner. So he starts crying, and they said to him, "Fear not, Agrippa. You are our brother. You are our brother. You are our brother." Right? This is a popular king. All right. So now we're back to the Mishnah describing what the king would do during this Hakel reading, and he reads from the beginning of, and these are the words. That's the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy. Until Hear, O Israel, Deuteronomy 6. So from Deuteronomy 1:1 through Deuteronomy 6:4, you read that entire section. And then Hear, O Israel, that's the first paragraph of the Shema. And it shall come to pass, if you shall hearken, that's the second paragraph of the Shema. You shall tithe, Deuteronomy chapter 14. When you have made an end of the tithing, so Deuteronomy chapter 26, and the passage concerning the king, Deuteronomy 17, and the blessings and the curses, Deuteronomy 28, until he finishes that entire portion. Right, so we have selections from the book of Deuteronomy, not the entire book, but selections from it. The blessings that the high priest recites, the king recites. So remember earlier we saw those 8 blessings that the high priest. So the king does the same ones, except he delivers concerning the festivals in place of forgiveness for iniquity. Right, so one of those blessings for the high priest was for forgiveness, which makes sense if he's doing that on Yom Kippur. Here, with the king doing this on Sukkot, you wouldn't talk about forgiveness from iniquity, so instead it's something to do with the festivals. Now, the Mishnah doesn't tell us what the wording of the blessings were. It just gives us the themes of the blessings. So we don't know exactly what it was. Was there a fixed liturgy? Did the king kind of come up with something, original each year, or did he have somebody write it for him? I would guess probably there was some flexibility in terms of the exact words. It just had to cover certain themes. So this is in the Mishnah. And so we're describing, both of these are describing Torah services, but they're not weekly Torah services, right? In the case of the high priest, it's once a year and it's taking place in the temple as part of what the high priest is doing. And in the case of the king, it's once every 7 years and it's taking place during Sukkot. So we do not have anything like a regular weekly Torah reading, and it's not taking place in a, let's say, in a more democratic way, or in a more egalitarian way, where people in different communities are doing this. We do have something called a synagogue in the temple. So that's kind of interesting. What was it? What was it for? Well, can we make any assumptions about what this synagogue was for? So I might suggest that it's the place where you keep the Torah scrolls, right? Because that's the person who is the first person to remove the Torah scrolls, right? It starts with the synagogue attendant, and then he gives it to the head of the synagogue. So one could imagine that they are the ones who are in charge of keeping the sacred scrolls, and there's some sort of cabinets or things like that in this place called a synagogue where it's all kept, and then it has to be brought out of there in some sort of a ritualized fashion. Okay, now let's look at some archaeology. This is the earliest known inscription from a synagogue. It's called the Theodotus inscription. It's from the 1st century CE. You can see the language it's in, right?
Is that Greek?
It's Greek. Any Greek readers here?
All Greek to me.
No, it's all Greek. All right. So this is the oldest synagogue inscription we've got, and as we might. Whoops, you guys still there?
Yeah.
All right, my
Yeah.
monitor just got funky.
Theodotus.
All right, so we have the Theodotus inscription, and here's what it says. Theodotus, son of Vetinus, priest and head of the synagogue, right? In Greek, it's archisynagogos. Son of a head of the synagogue and grandson of a head of the synagogue, right? So he's got Yichus, built the synagogue for the reading of the law and for the teaching of the commandments, as well as the guest room, the chambers, and the water fittings as an inn for those in need from abroad. The synagogue which his fathers founded with the elders and Simonides. Okay, so I need to, sorry, I need to fix my monitor here for a second. Okay, that's better. Okay, so what might we assume based on this inscription, right? This is a synagogue, a dedication plaque, right? So we've got this guy Theodotus who probably paid for the synagogue, right? And seems like he's come from a wealthy family who has done this kind of thing before. So based on what we've read here, what is the function of this synagogue? What is it used for?
Teaching of the commandments and reading.
it seems to have a dual purpose of learning and charity. That there's this inn for those in need.
Yeah, so it's an inn, right? Motel synagogue, right? Reading and teaching, right? So it's got this educational purpose. The word synagogue means gathering. So that in Hebrew, we would refer to the Beit HaKnesset, which means a house of gathering. Not a house of prayer. It's a place where people come together. So, notice what there seems to be a main room. There's a guest room, water fitting, right? So some sort of plumbing, it seems like, or maybe, and people,
Really?
travelers would come through and they would stay overnight in the synagogue.
Could I ask about the name Theodotus, somebody's name? I mean, it means God.
Theodotus, yeah, Theo, I guess is, yeah, I don't know what the dotus means at the end of that, but I mean, this was his name, Theodotus, son of Betanus.
But why was it in Greek? Were they speaking Greek there at the time?
Absolutely,
Oh,
at least
Educated
the
ones.
high class people were speaking Greek.
Yeah.
Right.
so that was the influence of the Greek coming to the Holy Land, so to speak.
Oh, well, they'd been there for centuries, right? I mean, ever since Alexander the Great conquered that land,
Okay.
it had been under Greek influence and then later Roman influence, but Greek was the language.
Mm.
I'd like to recommend this book I loved called Aphrodite and the Rabbis, which gives you this whole connection and how much of our Hebrew traditions, laws, whatever, come from the Greek.
Aphrodite and the Rabbis, yeah, it's written by Bert Vysotsky, who was one of my teachers in rabbinical school. It's a good book. So yeah, this is the equivalent of us putting a dedication plaque on our wall in English. All right, the language that people understood. We want people to read it and understand it. And the land of Israel is full of ancient synagogue excavations that have dedication plaques like this, often written in Greek.
So did the Greek replace the Aramaic?
No, you also see Aramaic written there as well, but I might assume that, maybe the big donors, the big funders are not necessarily the same people as the scholars.
Oh.
So if they want their name to appear, they want it to appear in Greek. Right?
Where was this
So,
found?
so you'll see synagogue mosaic floors that have both Greek and Aramaic written on them.
Where was this found?
This, I think, was found in, this may have been found in Jerusalem. Yeah.
So presumably they had their own copies of scrolls and things. And it sounded like in the Mishnah that the synagogue was part of the temple and the priest kept tabs on those scrolls. And at some point it branched out.
Well, someone kept tabs on the scrolls. So yeah, so this was found in Jerusalem in the area that's now known as the City of David. So just outside of the walls of the old city to the south. Yeah, so what we saw in the Mishnah, a description of attendants in charge of the synagogue on the temple grounds, but they were not priests though. They had to bring it to the priests. This guy, though, is a priest and head of the synagogue, right? So the priests in the Second Temple era were, especially in Jerusalem, they were aristocrats. They tended to be wealthy and in with the king. So they're kind of exactly the kind of people that one might imagine they would find on a synagogue inscription like this.
So they also had Greek names instead of Hebrew names or Aramaic names.
Yeah. What? Is that surprising?
Yeah, because basically they are supposed to be Israelites, right? But they're doing all this Greek stuff.
Well, I mean, why would you expect it to be any different there than it is here?
I don't know. It just seems odd to me that everything is in Greek. The
People are
names.
people. They want to see their name in a language they can understand.
Okay.
Right. And more importantly, if you're the donor, you want your name to be seen in a language that other people can understand.
Okay.
So
All
when
right.
did Hebrew die out as a language people spoke?
Sorry?
When did Hebrew die out as a language people spoke?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'd guess like sometime, connected to maybe the exile, the Babylonian exile, 6th century, right? So you have the community that's very disrupted, and all of the aristocrats are sent over into Babylonia, where they're speaking Aramaic, and then they come back and they bring their Aramaic with them. And this, the scribes, people like Ezra, they can understand Hebrew, but most people can't. All right, so this I think is a good place for us to stop this week in our uncovering of the development of the Torah service. So where are we at? We saw some early public readings of the Torah described in the Bible, first in Deuteronomy, and then seemingly influenced by that Deuteronomy, a ceremony that took place with Nehemiah and Ezra. And then we saw accounts from the Mishnah of what was taking place in the late Second Temple period, which also seems to be influenced by what is the biblical precedent is. And then we saw this inscription dating from that same period that the Mishnah is describing. And what we don't have is any sense that the synagogue is being used for prayer. All right, the synagogue is a place where Torah scrolls are kept. It's a place for teaching and learning and giving instruction, and it's a place for travelers to stay when they're on their way through. And that seems to be what the original purpose of the synagogue was. And the name synagoga or Beit Knesset seems to be a reflection of that as well. It's a house of gathering, right? This is where people come together.